In this video, we're going to be going over Substance 3D Modeler. Inside the program here, what we can see is that we have a tools panel over on the left, and we have this clay tool. And as soon as we click on it, we have these different primitive shapes. And these different primitive shapes are basically a preview of what we can create. As soon as we hit the space bar, we're actually going to lay down clay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click on one of these little gizmo handles to kind of move it out of the way. And you can see now I've kind of created a cube of clay. And if I click spacebar again, I can create these kind of cubes of clay wherever I want. And I can also come in here, moving these little handles around, and I can kind of decide where I want to add clay, even if they overlap each other. And what you're going to notice is that the clay is actually becoming one solid object when we kind of combined it. And I can even come in here and fill up areas that were kind of originally empty, and it'll respect that. One other thing we can think about with this is the ability to erase clay. So I can either hit the tab key to switch my current selected tool into a cutter. And if I hit the space bar, I'm going to delete whatever is inside the volume. And at any point during this process, I can come over to these primitive shapes and I can actually edit it and change it back to a different object to make my life a little bit easier. At this point, you should be able to come in here and kind of create different shapes. But let's talk a little bit more about editing these primitives. If I have this primitive shape right here, I actually have these different controls. As we saw, we can left click on these little arrows to move them around. What we can also do is we have these dots, and if I click and hold and drag, I can actually change the scale of these objects on their different axes. And this can be really handy to get a specific shape you're looking for. If we want to move this entire object uniformly, there's kind of this dot floating out in space by itself. And if I click and drag on that, I can scale the whole thing down. Another thing that's a really handy tip about creating these primitives is if I hover over one of these dots, you'll see that the top and the bottom both come in. If I hold down Control while I click drag, I can actually move just one side. Obviously, we also have these little kind of squares with circles around them. The squares allow us to move on two axes at the same time to kind of shift around, which if you've used other 3D software is pretty common. If not, just be aware that you can click on these and kind of move them. And then the other thing we have are these kind of rotators. So these little round discs. And this allows me to kind of position this and rotate it. And again, at any point here, I could hit spacebar and move it, and I've created more clay. The other thing we can do is hit R, which will reset our rotation back to default. But what I can do is I can hold down Control and I can click on this little disc, and you can see I can actually discretely rotate. The other thing to know about this discrete rotation is that if I move out my mouse, that circle, see how those green dots are kind of representing the rotation double? As I move my mouse outside of that, I can actually go to 15-degree increments. And this allows me a little bit more control over the position of this object. At this point, we've learned that we can rotate, we can transform, we can position these different pieces of clay, and we can combine them together. One thing you're going to notice though pretty quickly here is that some of this model is looking a bit jagged. And that's because this clay has a resolution. Imagine this scene that we're in, this space, is actually built up these tiny little cubes. And those cubes have a certain size. So to have a higher fidelity, we need to increase the number of those little cubes that represent our scene. And we can do that in an example here. If I show you this preview mesh, it has this texture kind of on it with grid pattern. If I right click inside the window here, I can come down to what is called clay resolution. When I see this, what's going to happen is you're going to notice that if I click it, the number of checker patterns on my object has increased. And if I click it again and again, you'll notice they keep getting smaller and smaller. Now, the unfortunate part is my old model here has more resolution now, but unfortunately, it's captured that data about being inaccurate. So just make sure that before you make a piece that the resolution seems to be about what you're looking for so that you don't run into any issues with resolution type errors. So now if I come and I hit spacebar and paste this down, what you're going to notice is a much crisper edge. The next thing we're going to look at is the ability to create new layers or the ability to control objects independently. You can see I pasted this down, and at this point, if I double click in the background, I can kind of come into selection mode, which is this top tool here. And this is all acting as one single object. So as we've been painting into a single layer. But there's gonna be times where we want to have artistic control to adjust objects or position them with more freedom. So if I just come in here, I can double click on an object again. I'm now adding more clay to it. And again, if I double click out, you can see I added that. But if I have nothing selected and I come over to the clay tool, you'll notice that my original tool becomes grayed out. And now it's not selectable. So now I can come in here and add this tube, and I can place it. And I can kind of say, oh, I want this cylinder thing to come in and out. I'll hit spacebar to create it. And now if I double click on the background, you'll see that I have the ability to swap between the two different independent objects. And this can be really handy to make sure that we can adjust things or reposition them after the fact. Another thing you can do is if you're inside of an object, again, you can see I clicked on the original large object. My new cylinder is grayed out because it's not selected. But if I come in here and I say, you know what, this makes a lot of sense to put this here, what I can do is I can right click and actually create a new layer, and my object is already perfectly scaled and it inherits the resolution of the object I clicked, whereas this original cylinder over here is lower res. So if I can click, now I have my new cylinder and it's created it on a new layer so that I can edit it freely. At this point, we can take a look at some of the other options that are available to us. So if I have an object like this cylinder right here, what I can come into is what's called Warp Tool. And Warp Tool can be pretty awesome. This can allow us to edit things in a more organic sense without kind of distorting things. So for starters, we have basically a sphere. As you see, we can click and drag on things. We can pull them out and get these organic shapes. We have the properties, so the size of the brush, the hardness, and the strength. And this allows us to kind of decide if it has hardness, it means that anything within the inner circle here is going to go with it 100%. And then everything in between the two will have the fall off curve, this down here. So we can think of it being like an S curve from the outside of that to the center. And this can get these nice little peaks and valleys. Another thing we can do inside of Substance Modeler that's kind of unique is, as you can see, I kind of have this brush over the surface, but if I hit G, I can actually toggle between what is referred to as surface or gizmo mode. So now I can actually physically position this with a mouse, and just like how we were creating clay, I can hold down spacebar and I can click and drag, and I'm going to have a much more precise and accurate way of editing this brush. So this gives me a lot of flexibility when I want to edit things. If I were to undo these kind of transforms here, what's something cool we can do is we can actually come over to the warp tool, and they have different shapes. One of them is a cube, and what I like to do is reset the rotation on this cube. So you just tap R. That'll kind of reset it back to kind of world scale. And I like to scale it up, and then we can shift it over, increase the hardness, and what we can do is scale it up a little bit. And what you're going to notice is that based on the size and how far my hardness goes, so again, the inside box is 100% going to move, and the outside box will have an S curve. So if I position it like this, I'm basically able to hold down spacebar and then shift over and get this kind of like nice little S curve bend in my pipe. What you can also do is combined movements. So I'm going to show you how it would look if you did it as discrete individual movements, not all as one. So let's say that I wanted to rotate my pipe. So I'm holding down spacebar, and now I'm going to let go of spacebar. And then I'm going to hold spacebar and move it. You can see how badly this looks. You have this kind of crunchy little area down here, it's pinched, and this odd area. If I undo this, one interesting thing about Substance Modeler is that we can actually do multiple move operations at once. So how we would do that is we would hold down spacebar and rotate, but do not let go of spacebar. So I'm going to let go of just the left mouse button. And at this point, now I can move it, and it's considered all just one motion. And that can be really handy for us to, I'm again just still holding down spacebar, kind of adjust it and get kind of these bend shapes. As soon as I'm kind of happy with that, then I can let go of spacebar, and I can get these more organic shapes pretty quickly. The next thing we can look at are some of the sculpting tools. So inside of here, not only can we sculpt with these primitive shapes, but there's going to be times where we want to kind of smooth out or build up things. So we actually have a smoothing tool, and again, we can change its size of the brush. If you don't want to use the button over here for size, what we can do is hold down Control and left click and drag left and right. And we can actually come in here and actually just start to smooth out some of these transitions by left clicking and holding down. And this will help kind of clean up some of those transition areas. If for some reason we felt like we needed a bit more body, we can come in here to the buildup and again, hold down Control and we can kind of come in here and click and add a brush right here. So if I turn the hardness down and keep my size a little bit large, I can come in here and just kind of add a little bit of volume back where that pipe started to collapse. And if at any point I want to switch back to my smoothing tool, there's a shortcut just to hold down Shift, and I can use that to come in here and kind of smooth out any of those additional changes that I made. From here, we also have an inflate tool. This again just gives me volume. So if I just kind of come in here and start to sculpt in, what you're going to see is that I'm kind of adding a larger amount. At any point, a lot of these tools have these modes where we can select to just affect the tops and the bottoms, or in this effect, basically we want to push in or pull out. We can swap that right here. And we can also do that with the tab key. Lastly, in our tools, we have the painting ability. As you can see, if I double click on the canvas or hit V to go to the selection tool, then double click, everything's been painted with the same color selected in the color picker right here. And if I were to kind of go into an object and select a new color, nothing will happen, but I can actually come in here and paint, say, a part of this mesh. Now, right now in this version of Substance Modeler, there's no easy way to paint the whole thing, but what I notice is if we just make our brush really, really big, put our hardness to 100, and then click on the object, we basically can flood fill in a sense. So this allows us to, again, very quickly come in and colorize pieces, click on them, move them, and position them so that we can get them exactly where we want inside the scene. From here, we're going to talk a little bit about symmetry. So I'm going to make a brand new scene, and let's talk about the two different options. For one, if I have this clay, so I have this clay cube right here, what I can do is I can lay down some clay, and then I'm going to move this preview brush out of the way. And again, our scene is basically this green arrow kind of acts as the forward. And what we're going to do is we can right click, because this clay is now on a layer, and we have these symmetry and repetition options. If I do mirror symmetry, what you're going to notice is that this piece of geometry now is got a cut plane down the middle, and I can do symmetry actions just like this around that green axis. As of this version, there's no way to change the axes that the symmetry happens on, as far as I'm aware. So if you know, please add it in the comments below. But I can come in here and now work symmetrically on this model, and that can make my life a lot easier. Now, one thing to note is that we also have the ability to do what is called repetition. And you might be asking yourself, well, what's the difference? Well, symmetry is basically taking one piece of clay, even if it's separate, and it's treating it as one object. So let's take a look what that could mean. So I'm going to undo this clay here, and I'm going to go back to the clay tool and just move it off center. Lay down a piece of clay, come in here and turn on symmetry, and you'll notice that if I hit space now, I'll have a piece of clay that's symmetrical on both sides. If I go to the selection tool though and say I want to rotate it, it rotates it all as one object, because that's what it's seeing. It's one symmetry plane, one object. But let's say that I wanted these to be on two different sides of an object. I don't want them to rotate together. I want them to be two independent objects. What I can do is I can undo. Let's go back to the clay tool here. And this time I'm going to turn on repetition. What it's going to do is it's going to repeat the object as an instance on the other side of the symmetry plane. So as soon as I tap the space bar, you're going to see, if I hit V and I drop, I have the original actual mesh, and I have anything that's an instance of it will have this kind of like pattern laid on top. And what's great about this is that now these objects are sharing the same information, but they act as independent instances. As you saw before, when I had to rotate around, they would move together on that main axis, and now they kind of respect their own position relative to each other. And so I can still come in here with the clay tool and say make an edit or a cut on this. So let's go tab and cut the corner out. And you can see, just like we had with symmetry, we have a little bit more ability to kind of customize this and the ability to place them. Beyond just the mirrored repetition, we can turn on radial. So again, each one of these is acting as an instance of each other, so we can do local commands and controls. Now, a little trick is that, let's say, when we use this operation, the one limitation right now is that these options for kaleidoscope and for radial, they rely on kind of the grid up to do this. So the blue axis is what it's always rotating around. But let's say I wanted to put this onto the side of an object. How would I go about doing that? Because right now, whenever I select this, each one is just kind of moving by itself. And that's done through grouping. So if I click on this object and I right click and I go to group, what I can do is I can actually merge all these together underneath a single node. And what this will allow me to do is take this now and treat it by holding down control. I can rotate it 90, and that kind of group is acting as its world origin. So to it's, as you can see here when we rotated it, its up axis, the blue axis, is still pointing this way. So now if I double click, I can get into that group. And then again, I would click on a mesh in that group, and then I can still edit it from here. And any one of them can be edited, and the other ones will become instances, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But if I come into here and then I go to the clay tool, I'm still able to come in and change attributes. Let's say we wanted to round this, do a cut. And because they're all symmetrical to each other, or repetitions to each other, it allows me to quickly make an edit that kind of works anywhere in the scene. Let's say that we have an instance where we don't want them to be radially instanced, but we want to be able to place them more freely around the scene, but have them be instances. Well, how would we go about doing that? Because right now, the only options we see are for across the mirror plane or radially. So let's just start fresh. I'm going to go File, New, and we can just talk about this. But let's say I make this little cube right here. I'm going to, again, hit spacebar, put down some clay, and I'm going to just quickly kind of edit it so we can see what's happening. So I'm going to hit V to go to Selection Tool. So now that I have this guy, let's say that I wanted to place him kind of more organically around my scene. With this mesh selected, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to Make Link. And this basically is going to turn this mesh into an instance that anytime I copy it, it'll be linked to every other copy. So now that I've clicked Make Link, what I can do is I can take this and I can Control D to duplicate it. And so again, this is its own instance. I can rotate it, I can scale it uniformly. But if I come back into this main tool here, and let's say that I decide, you know what, actually I want is an extra cut right here, this other instance will be exactly updated in the same exact way. And I can come in here and again, make more duplicates of this. And you'll see, because this was duplicated from this, they're actually duplicating off each other. So this is really powerful. This allows me a lot of flexibility in terms of like what I want to do. Now, when we're in the tool and we duplicate, that's duplicating within the tool. If I double click though, and I click just at the high level and I duplicate, it's gonna just duplicate the entire thing, not to every instance. So hopefully that makes a little bit sense about how they're going about the different phases of what's part of the object versus what's part of the layer. So hopefully this makes sense, but feel free to try this out and play with it. It's very powerful. This can give you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can create different versions of this object. From here, we have some different Boolean operations. So we looked at with our clay, so we File, New here. We put down our clay, we took this tool and we just moved it and we hit Tab to turn into a cutter, hit spacebar to cut. Now, let's say that I want a shape to cut that's not just one of these Boolean shapes, one of these primitives. How would I go about creating that? Well, what I can actually do is I can come in here and let's say that I make a shape. Let's take this cylinder here, and I'm just going to make this odd shape just real quick, this thing. So if I have this shape, I'm just going to leave it here. I'm going to double click on my scene so that I can make a new object. Go to the clay tool and let's just make a cube. I'm going to scale it up a little bit. And I'm going to hit space to make it real. Double click on the canvas to come back. Now what I can do is I can take this shape and I can actually make it into a Boolean cutter operation. So what I can do is I can take this and we can go down to this little option right here, this Boolean actions. Once I click on that, I can actually enable subtraction from selection. So it'll turn whatever selected into a cutter. So if I click on that, I can take this mesh and I can stick it into another mesh and then right click and apply. And if I hit H to hide that cutter, you can see I used a mesh as a cutting tool. So this is another powerful way for you to be able to, let's say, again, hit H to bring everything back. I could reuse this. I can rotate it. I could place it. And again, just right click and apply. and I can make those cuts. An option that you might have available to you that if you want to make this easier to see what's happening, so let's undo that, is if I go to Preferences, Experimental, we can actually turn Live Boolean Preview on. And what this will show me is a rough preview of what this cut will do. And we already cut there, so let's undo that. Let me go back to my clay tool here. So if we take this guy and we rotate him, and we put him on the corner here, I get a better idea of how this is going to edit my other shape. And again, I can just right click and apply that, and you'll see. Now, what's happening is the preview is still happening on top of the cut, so we get this kind of weird funky preview. But if I just select my cutter and hit H to hide it temporarily, I can do that. So I can see what kind of shape I've created. Hit H to bring everything else back. And I can always select any mesh in here and just hit delete and delete it. One thing we kind of passed by before is we have these parameters. So the parameters allow us to come in and edit the overall shape of the mesh that we're using as an adder or a cutter. So again, I can come in here, I can increase or decrease the resolution, and this will allow me a lot of flexibility in terms of creating a shape that I can either add to my scene or use to cut out certain sections of my mesh. Now, another little handy tip is if you're working with meshes, if you control and single click on either the gizmos, so the move gizmo, I can flip it basically opposite by holding down control and clicking. Or on a kind of the rotation wheels here, if I click a single time, I can rotate 90 very quickly on that axis. So this can be really handy if you're working with certain cutters or meshes and you're like, oh, okay, I just want to move it. I don't want to have to move the little handle very slowly. So I think in general, this gives us a good idea of a lot of the different tools that are available to us inside of Substance Modeler. If you have more questions about kind of the basics and getting started, please just reach out and we can go from there. But hopefully this was helpful. If you like this video, please leave a like. And if you feel like subscribing, go for it. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.